around before we get into the actual introduction was obviously oral therapy is something that we as an industry are very keen on, and multiple facets here. We not only can make the product, the API, but we make the delivery systems, the packaging systems, and I had Meghan and Dr. Williams take a walk through, and there's pretty much all kinds of gadgets to move this stuff along. So, having said all of that, that's not that to give you the thinking behind that, but now what I'm going to do is, as a way of introduction, and so we understand what it is. Meghan, as you can see, our industry is kind of new at all this, so I don't think they're aware of, well, except for our friend here from Broadpath. Thank you very much. So it made us look intelligent that time. That's great. But anyway, we're going to, you give us a little background on LRF. What is the Lymphoma Research Foundation?
Sure. Well, thank you, Russ and Dr. Williams. Nice to be here to discuss this very important topic. The Lymphoma Research Foundation is the nation's largest nonprofit organization devoted to exclusively funding lymphoma and CLL research and to the provision of patient and provider education and resources. So our mission is to eradicate lymphoma and serve those touched by this disease. We do that through direct investment in biomedical research. To date, our foundation has invested more than $60 million in lymphoma-specific research. And we in turn use that information as well as the guidance of our expert scientific advisory board, of which Dr. Williams is a member, to help inform our patient programming and ensure that patients, their caregivers, as well as the healthcare professionals who care for them have the information they need to participate in shared decision making and to ensure that they have the latest information to make informed decisions about their treatment and care.
Interesting anecdotal story. This morning we were getting some of the infrastructure straightened out, Meg, and the woman who helped us put the stuff together, actually her dad used the LRF. And by the way, he's better now, but the point was she knew all about it. So the answer is, you're getting the job done. She just came out of nowhere as soon as but she recognized LRF and she came up to us and talked. So the next one, Dr. Williams, so over the last 10 years, there's been like a shift, and it's pretty much, in the way that CLL is treated. And this change includes the moving of treatment from this typical infusion center to an oral therapy and medications at home. And I think everybody thinks that that's, nirvana, but I think, can we look at a top line? What are the challenges in the therapy and in other words, home therapy versus the conventional therapy. So, when you talk to your patients, what sort of a conversation do you have?
Well, my thanks as well for including us in the program today. So this is, lymphoma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia are very complicated subtypes of cancer. So in the current iteration, there's about 100 different subtypes. And at a molecular level, they can be very unique from patient to patient. Traditionally, up until just 5 to 7 years ago, treatment, when it was needed, was based upon the sort of the way the tumor looked under the microscope, how it was classified, and it was almost always the treatment was based with chemotherapy or immunotherapy with a monoclonal antibody. In some cases, radiation therapy was also added. So, it's important to recognize that with all these types of lymphoma, some of them tend to be very aggressive, rapidly proliferating, and but potentially curable. But if you don't cure the aggressive patients in the early going, then many of those patients don't have very long survival. On the other end, there are a number of subtypes of CLL and lymphoma that have a very slow growing course. You may be able to follow them for months and even many years without any therapy at all. But paradoxically, those patients are very, very hard to cure with any standard therapy. So a very heterogeneous disease with very complex molecular underpinnings. But in recent years, we now have very good insight into what drives the development of individual types of lymphoma and CLL. And so that helps us be much more accurate with our diagnosis. But relevant to the discussion today, pharmaceutical companies and investigators in academia have been able to identify the particular molecular pathways that these tumors depend upon for survival and proliferation. and you can target those pathways with small molecules that can actually cause death of these cells and often very impressive responses even in people with very advanced disease that's resistant to all of our current existing therapies. So we now have new tools for diagnosis, and we have new tools to treat these patients that a few years ago had no good options for therapy. Importantly, the pharmacogenomics and the pharmacokinetic development of these drugs has gotten to the point that many of them can be converted to be orally bioavailable, as opposed to the traditional treatment of lymphoma and most cancers, where you come to your oncologist's office or an infusion center and you get an IV and you get the drug given parenterally. So now the treatment can be given at home, which is terrific on all kinds of levels, but it raises whole new needs in terms of the care model that oncology office provides, because you don't have the patient coming in every week or 2 weeks for labs, and then every 3 weeks they're getting treated, where you are right on top of everything. Now they're out there taking their anti-cancer medicine, and you have to have different ways to manage and educate those patients. So it's a very different landscape right now, but a very dynamic and exciting one because of the improved outcomes for patients.
So Meghan, I mean, LRF has been in the forefront of this with the changing therapies and oral therapy workshop, for example, and that series, so better understand the changes and how they impact it. So can you give us a little bit of background on the workshop and how you engaged, and now that we better understand the situation and develop the next steps?
Absolutely. So because every facet of our programming is informed by our scientific experts, we fully anticipated through our education programs that the advent of oral therapies to treat lymphoma and CLL was really going to represent a paradigm shift in the way cancer patients were treated. And so one of the first things that our foundation identified as a demonstrable need was to help educate patients not only about the new therapies that were going to be available, but really the additional administrative oversight that they were going to have to take upon themselves to ensure that these treatments were appropriate for them, that they were well prepared for that dialogue with their healthcare team to make certain that it was an appropriate therapy. And then, of course, that they were fully supported and really understood the importance of adherence, of monitoring treatment side effects, because for the most part, they were going to be active participants and were going to need to actively communicate that information to their healthcare team. So when Dr. Williams cited the need for appropriate patient education, we were thankfully on kind of the cutting edge to be able to bring that information to patients. Now, what we quickly saw and heard from both the patients whom we exist to serve, as well as our scientific experts, many of these issues quickly came to bear. And so our foundation grappled with how best to serve patients, but then also as a community, we might be able to address these issues, because we quickly also realized that these issues were not going to be addressed in a silo. And so we sought advice from our scientific leadership, including Dr. Williams, and tried to identify the best platform by which we might be able to fully identify and understand some of the issues we were grappling with as a community, and then come away with actionable objectives from these sessions to better understand what we could do to help serve the scientific community, to act as a convener, and then, of course, to create resources for the patients that were seeking information from the Lymphoma Research Foundation. And that was really the genesis for our initial lymphoma workshop that really sought to address some of and identify for the first time some of the issues our community was witnessing.
Okay, so Dr. Williams, as I understand it, then you co-chaired 2 workshops. So you explored the topic, right? And you published 2 white papers. And these, by the way, you can get these on their website, the LRF website. But what did you learn? I mean, you must have learned a lot from the first. You had to have a second. So why don't we get into like what the adherence to oral treatments, the regimens? I mean, it must have been an incredible. Fine, I think I'm starting to wear out. Please, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
So we did learn a lot from the first meeting that then helped us focus our second one, and I'll say some details about that in just a minute. I want to provide just one other piece of context around the the treatment, I mentioned that where the paradigm has shifted from intravenous treatment in the office to home therapy. And when we give treatment for most cancers, but especially lymphoma, typically a patient will get cycles of treatment, so 4 or 6 or 8 rounds of treatment, and then therapy is done. We restage and make sure we've got the disease in remission, and then the patient enters follow-up, and hopefully many of them are cured, and many of them in fact are cured, but other people will not respond to the initial therapy at all and have to shift. Others will have a remission but then recur at some point. And so then the question is, how do you manage those patients? But it's intermittent therapy. With most all of these oral drugs, they're inhibitory and they don't necessarily completely wipe out every last tumor cell. And so it becomes necessary to have patients on continuous therapy with most of these drugs. So it's not just that we're switching them to oral, but we're taking them from being on treatment for several months to where they're going to be on a drug potentially for life, certainly for years. So that focused our attention through the Scientific Advisory Board of the LRF, since many of us are either clinical or translational science investigators, is how do we exploit the power of these drugs? How do we identify what the reasons are that only, say, 60% of people respond to a particular drug? Can we improve that by combining drugs that target 2 different pathways in that cancer? And then how do we manage patients who may be on an anti-cancer therapy for years? And so that was really, as a research organization, the LRF focused on trying to define what the questions are in the era of oral therapies so that we could try to optimize treatment for individual patients. So the first workshop, as Meg said, was really, I think, a high watermark in terms of shifting into gear for evaluating these kinds of treatments. So the workshop was held in Washington, D.C. We had government representatives from the FDA, we had people from pharmacology companies that were makers of these drugs, we had academic investigators, we had patient advocacy groups for a variety of lymphoma and CLL groups that were there. And we talked about a fairly broad range of topics and came out of that with the first white paper that you can access on lymphoma.org that outlines what the take-home messages were. But one of the big messages was that adherence to their long-term anti-cancer therapy was a critical determinant in outcome. It's interesting that many of these drugs, especially when you're treating some of the higher grade subtypes of lymphoma and CLL, if patients stop the drug, they'll very rapidly relapse. And sometimes it can be hard to then get them back under control. So patients have to be aware of that. Some of the drugs have side effects that require that if a patient's going to have a surgical procedure, the drug has to be held for a week or 2 or 3, and some patients will progress during that time. So there's a lot to learn about adherence, and in our second workshop, we sought to understand both the research tools that would be available for that, so we brought experts to speak to that. We had a representative from the National Cancer Institute who's leading the grant proposal mechanism for people to investigate oral anti-cancer therapies, not just in lymphoma. And we invited a colleague who has expertise in another disease, another blood disease called chronic myeloid leukemia. So CML, up until about 15, 20 years ago, was only curable by an aggressive allogeneic stem cell transplantation. But it was recognized what the molecular Achilles heel is in that tumor. And so a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, imatinib, was the first of now a series of those drugs that put the majority of patients into a remission for many years. But so as an example of why adherence is relevant, we had Dr. Michael Morrow from the Sloan Kettering, who's been an expert in managing these patients, come and speak to us. And so one of the points of adherence that really strikes a chord with all of us is that if patients have 90% or better compliance with taking their medication once a day, every day, then they have about an 80 to 85% likelihood of achieving what's called a major molecular response. So they're virtually in a molecular remission, so almost no detectable cell or no detectable cells in the body. If you are below 80% compliance, your chance of getting a major response is below 20%. So compliance is a really critical thing, and why people don't take the drug reliably, especially after a year or two on it, they're feeling well, they get less compulsive about taking it, has real impact. We don't know yet about how relevant that is for a lot of the oral drugs in lymphoma, but those are the things we wanted to explore with an adherence-focused workshop. And I think, I'll say quite honestly, going into it even as co-chair, I wasn't sure how meaty a topic that was going to be, and I was blown away by how much I learned, how much there is to learn about this. And so the LRF is now, exploring and making progress in getting education about this out there, and also helping develop the next questions and what the research support can be to answer those questions.
So Meghan, why don't we get into some of that HopeLine education stuff we're talking about? I mean, one of the outreach, it's not an outreach, but you're there, LRF is there. We just noted 2 major documents that are sitting out there if people wanted to get them. I mean, to me, so what's the overview? What kind of questions do you get in light of what Dr. Williams was saying?
So I think certainly our existing education efforts were supplemented by these 2 workshops and drew much needed attention to some of the topics that we discussed. So the Lymphoma Helpline is the Lymphoma Research Foundation's primary vehicle for patient and caregiver support services. We employ master's level clinical trained social workers with an expertise in the hematologic malignancies. They're available to lymphoma and CLL patients and their caregivers every single day to provide them with additional support in the form of our own education materials, enrollment in our buddy program, a one-to-one peer support program that can link patients or caregivers up with another patient or caregiver who have had a similar experience with their lymphoma diagnosis or their treatment. Our helpline also offers a free clinical trial information service. In a disease state like lymphoma, enrollment and access to clinical trials is absolutely critical for our patients. And we know that some of the existing mechanisms by which patients can traditionally learn about clinical trials can be incredibly challenging, particularly if there are healthcare literacy issues at play. And so our helpline social workers will actually develop and run individual trial searches for patients and their care team, provide them with that information, and prepare them to have a conversation with their healthcare team. And particularly when thinking about either a clinical trial or beginning a regimen with an oral therapy, patients are often turning to our helpline to discuss some of these critical issues. And I think the publication of both white papers drew attention to critical issues like adherence. And what we heard from patients and their caregivers was that they needed some scaffolding, some support services to help them for what they now were beginning to understand was going to be a fairly long-term commitment with these new therapies. And so they wanted to identify some of the tools and education mechanisms we or others might have made available to them to help assist them as they thought about utilizing these new therapies. I'll use our mobile app as just one example of some of the tools and interventions that we've now developed, partially with these patients in mind, to help assist them as they've begun to utilize oral therapies for a treatment for their lymphoma or CLL.
Dr. Williams, in your clinical practice, I mean, I assume you hear similar questions from patients. They want to talk about their oral therapies, they want to take, how do they take their medication? I mean, to me, you must be concerned about how open they're being with you. I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, you're not there,
Yeah, so I think the trap that many oncologists fall into is, and this is what always surprises me about the data I just told you about chronic myeloid leukemia. You figure, I got cancer, I take this pill every day, the cancer stays away. You know, that would be a pretty big motivator, you would think. But obviously, not everybody does it. And there's a variety of reasons. And we're not pointing a finger that patients are irresponsible. It may be that, these drugs are not perfect. Every medication, whether it's for blood pressure or diabetes or whatever, has side effects. And, compared with chemotherapy, the side effects of these medications is typically much, much lower. So the therapeutic index between effective dose and toxicity is much greater than chemo, where you're right on that line for most patients. But that doesn't mean they don't have side effects. They may have, low-level nausea, muscle and joint aches, diarrhea, lots of easy bruising and things like that, depending on the drug. And so those have an impact on quality of life. If you are experiencing those things every day, then you're sort of not well. You're feeling the side effects of a treatment that you're using. So there are a variety of reasons patients might not be so vigilant about it. But coming back to the education piece that Meg brought up, it's really relevant because patients have to understand not just what to expect, but what things they have to avoid. So many of these drugs are CYP inhibitors, and so they can interact in positive or negative ways with other medications that a patient might take. And therefore, you can see unexpected toxicities, or you can see a loss of efficacy. One of the drugs that's used to treat a solid tumor, it's an oral kinase inhibitor. I came across an article that said if you take a proton pump inhibitor with that, you markedly lower the efficacy of that drug because you don't absorb it. You need acid to absorb the drug. And so if people are taking that, then even if they're being reliable, they're not getting the effect. So drug-drug interactions is a big deal that you have to educate patients about when they're on these medications, and they need to follow up with you or before starting anything. And we try to warn them away from any sort of herbal supplements and over-the-counter things, because there's no quality control with this. You don't know what's in it, and you don't know what the interaction might be. So there's a lot they have to understand and buy into when they're going on one of these long-term therapies.
I had just, as a pharmacist myself, I mean, the polypharmacies are something that your partner should be monitoring too. I mean, the interactions he should be catching as well and bringing them up. I mean,
we look at that every visit, and we have the advantage in an academic center. We have PharmDs that are assigned I have one in my hematologic malignancies group, and one of the things that I wanted to point out about some of the research in compliance with an oral drug is that when you start a patient on an oral drug, one of the biggest benefits you can get in compliance longer term is that within the first 1 to 2 weeks the patient's on the drug, that they get 2 or 3 calls from a nurse and or a pharmacist to see how are you doing, when are you taking it, make sure they're doing it correctly, do they have questions about it. Those are big satisfiers for getting patients to take the drug correctly and get the opportunity for the most benefit they can get from it. And those are the kinds of things, again, that the app and our other applications through LRF can help patients with.
So you must, on these conversations on the helpline, Meg, I can only imagine people must tell you, well, they must have every reason from being non-adherent, right? I mean, what is your most concern with these? Is it, I'm not being adherent, so, is there a top 10 list or,
Well, I don't know if there's a top 10 list, but I think some of the common concerns or questions we receive from patients who are utilizing an oral therapy certainly has to do with adherence. We find that many of them, and I think some of this comes back to the connectivity with the healthcare team that Dr. Williams referred to, you have to think a little bit differently about a patient who's responsible for the management of their treatment in a much more meaningful way than we've seen in the past with traditional IV treatments. So just the fact that some of these patients or their caregivers are calling a nonprofit organization like my own's helpline to ask questions about their treatment and their treatment schedule, I think was really eye-opening and a really interesting part of the conversation during the workshop on adherence, just the fact that they are out seeking advice. So more often than not, many of our HopeLine colleagues are referring patients back to their healthcare team to let them know that if they have a question about their treatment schedule, about their adherence, treatment side effects is often a very highly cited topic among these patients because there's a certain degree of uncertainty as to when it's appropriate to contact their physician or their pharmacist about some of the challenges they're facing. Something, again, that many of them who maybe previously had been treated in a hospital or clinic setting never had to really grapple with when and if it's appropriate to contact their healthcare team. Their healthcare team was always there on site during treatment administration. So they needed to think differently about how and when to communicate, and I think that's often an important source of information and questions we receive from patients. I think the financial burden that some patients experience related to the cost of their treatment and care across the paradigm is something our HopeLine colleagues often report out on as well. In the case of oral therapies, we know that antiquated benefit design often results in disproportionate cost sharing for patients who are utilizing an oral therapy rather than those who are receiving treatment or care in the hospital or inpatient setting, because they are often paying for these therapies out of their pharmacy benefit, and it exposes them quite often to very high levels of cost sharing. And so LRF, along with some of our scientific advisors and a number of members of Congress, are looking into this issue, but a lot of this has been predicated on feedback we're hearing from patients. But there too, we often encourage patients, we either refer them to some of our own financial resources or back to the institutions, because we often know that financial pressures in the case of a prescription drug will often lead a patient to self-manage at home. So maybe cutting a pill in half, moving their dosage to every other day, and not necessarily referring to their healthcare team to make some of these decisions, or letting their healthcare team know that they're in a position to not afford their medication.
So, Dr. Williams, I mean, we're here with people that we make it, we produce it, I mean, you name it, that's what we're all about. So these adherence, I mean, is there something we as an industry should be doing? I mean, is it the size? Can't change the pharmacology in a lot of cases, but we could certainly mitigate things, We can, there's a lot of games that can be played with the active itself, so.
Well, so there's a lot contained in that question, and
thank you.
So I'm not the person probably to answer a lot of it, but so I'll make a couple of comments. One is, patients sometimes complain about the size of pills and things like that, so maybe an issue. Capsules versus tablets, probably not so much, but a couple of things that come to mind are, so what happens when you have to start a drug up sort of in a stepwise fashion, or you have to feather it in on top of a medication you're discontinuing. So those are, unknowns right now. And so the way, if you will, starter packs for some of these medications are put together can be very helpful to get patients over the initial part of this, which can be a little intimidating. As we get into an era now where we're using the oral targeted drugs either combined with forms of chemotherapy or immunotherapy or dual targeted drugs, that gets to be a pretty complicated medication list. Forget that they're taking multiple other things for comorbidities. And so getting patients where they've got a regimen they have to take where one of the drugs is every day, one of them is once a week, one of them might be twice a week, but only for 3 weeks out of 4. That's complicated stuff for a very educated, sophisticated healthcare consumer. So it's not so easy, and it's, like I said, it's very different from a management standpoint, as opposed to, well, I come in once every 3 weeks for my IV treatment, and then we check everything out. I see the doctor, the nurse practitioner, I make sure things are good, blood counts are okay, and we move ahead. So it gets to be a challenge when you're putting these things together and trying to work through the clinical investigation of deciding, can you safely put drug A with B, what dose for each and what schedule for each, is a complicated clinical trial to design and run and interpret. So it probably has more to do with those sorts of things for me than the particular formulation of the medication itself.
I mean, the other component is your patient's got to take it forever. I mean, there's got to be, you got to have some concerns around. I mean, forever's a long time, last I checked. And
right, it
so,
is.
yeah, I mean, what do you have to address? I mean,
Right.
there's got to be a lot there.
Well,
I mean,
so right now that's the way it's done.
Right.
But a big focus of research is what are the mechanisms we can use to have time-limited therapy, like we do with regular chemotherapy. I mentioned that some of the medications, when you give them, when a patient comes off, they'll typically progress fairly quickly. So if you give 2 of these drugs together, then perhaps you can get a much deeper response, a much faster response, and we can monitor patients with these same molecular tools that we use to characterize the susceptible pathways in the lymphoma cells. We can find when they really become, minimal residual disease, MRD negative, and then if you get that deeper remission, then it's potentially you can be successful coming off the drugs. So you do for 6 or 12 months or 2 years and then stop, and then follow them with their molecular markers. And if they start to increase again, then you preemptively get back in before they have an overt clinical relapse. So it allows you to do intermittent therapy at great savings of exposure to long-term risk, at great savings of cost to the patient and the health system, and like I said, potentially getting better outcomes and allowing them to benefit from the drug for a longer period of time.
I mean, so it sounds to me like the biomarker, I mean, that's important. I mean, the bottom line was, you dose until you think it's right. I mean, then we got, now we got a biomarker, and
Right.
it's more sensitive. So,
Right.
Yeah, we can probably cut back or tune it. I mean,
Right.
that's the
Circulating
key.
tumor DNA, circulating tumor cells, those are all tools that can be used, and they're in many ways much more sensitive than even our best exam and routine labs and CT or PET imaging. You get a much better look at a true molecular or deep remission, and in many types of cancer that correlates with better outcome, and it allows you to identify patients who can come off treatment, or if they're not clearing their MRD, then okay, with drug A alone, they're not going to get where we want them, so we're going to add something else, a monoclonal antibody or another targeted drug. So there's a lot of this, it can be rationally designed knowing which pathways are relevant in individual lymphoma types, but you still have to do the clinical study and you have to do the investigations to show that they in fact are safe and efficacious.
I think you bring up a good point. I think it really, one of the things that we as an industry are faced with all the time is time to market. I mean, the other end, put it another way, it's getting it to the patients faster, right? So one of the things that we do is, I'll give you a trade secret, fast track to market is a capsule. That's the easiest thing for us to make, okay? So, I mean, bottom line is, and then what we'll do is we'll come out with the tablet some other time. In other words, here is, it's essentially what you would have worked with in a clinical environment. Almost all clinical studies that are oral are done by capsule. So do you have, talking about, do you, as a clinician, I mean, does it bother you that we make a dosage form change midstream there? Does any concerns to you?
Well, I can't say I personally have many concerns, because I know there's a lot of regulatory boundaries on things like that have to be vetted before the new formulation can be released. I guess my only sort of request of the people doing the development of what the dose form and size, and is it a capsule or a tablet, the details of that don't matter so much. But for most patients with these drugs, especially over time, you're going to be making some kind of an adjustment. Often, they'll have some side effect, whether it's rash or joint pain or diarrhea, other GI side effects, and so you want to cut the dose in half. And if since almost all of these drugs come through specialty pharmacies, they get a 1-month supply delivered, by express delivery. And so if I want to cut the dose in half in the middle of a cycle, I can't really do that without another prescription, which I probably can't get approved because they haven't used the previous one. And so having, different sizes that you can, and the facility to go to adjust the dose and titrate it for individual patients, is a priority for those of us that are practicing.
That's a very important key, because remember, and shockingly, we run into this in cardiovascular. In fact, one of my old colleagues from Novartis is here, and he and I would talk. Bottom line was, and it makes sense, right? I get it. You want to drop from an 80 to a 40, yeah. But if I didn't catch that when I did the initial clinical study, I got a retrofit, which means I think we have to be more proactive. I think when we're doing the clinical studies, if this has to be done, we have to get some word out to people who are doing the clinical studies. We want this range, because once the NDA is in, the boat is sailed. And then, let's say, even if we fast-tracked it, you're talking 18 to 24 months before the thing's out there. What I'm saying is we got to know that ahead of time. It's not that we wouldn't do it. But you know what I mean?
Well, I do, and it's, it is, in fact, it's exciting that these drugs can be developed, that they can work as well as they do for many patients, and because it's not like the old days where if you were doing a new chemotherapy regimen where you were adjusting one of the drug doses, you would get some pretty marginal incremental improvement potentially that would give you another indication. With these targeted drugs, in the phase 1 and 2 studies, they've got biologic activity and they've got clinical effect. So it is exciting that, at least from the standpoint of getting the drugs from the early phase 1, 2 studies into patients and getting approvals is pretty fast. But a lot of those kind of questions that you just put forward don't have a chance to really get addressed, because most of the time we don't find MTDs. You're not dealing with cytotoxic chemo. You can, whether it's an antibody or one of these targeted drugs, you can get up to the highest doses you test, and you don't reach an MTD. So then that just becomes, okay, we'll use this dose. It looks effective and it looks reasonably well tolerated. So you don't have that other dose.
Right.
Experience, I guess, that helps you, fine tune it.
It sounds to me that this is something that we should educate industry about. No company worth their salt goes into a cardiovascular study without giving a full range. Help me out there. That's one thing.
Well, it's true, but again, you see the clinical effect, the biologic effect, and you can, for many of these, you can assess the target occupancy by the drug. So you know that not only does this drug seem safe at this dose, but you've got 95% occupancy of the molecular target.
Right.
So that's your goal.
Right.
And the other parts of it are, this was a big discussion early on when some of these drugs came out, is how important is it to be really specific to the target? Because most of these tyrosine kinase inhibitors, of course, have off-target effects. Maybe some of those are in fact relevant to the response. So if you get things that are more targeted, it seems that you have fewer toxicities with that. And the responses for most classes of these pathway inhibitors seem to be maintained. So that's kind of the way we move, but it's a complicated question, like I said.
No, as a formulator myself, I can come up with, that's where I'm at. The other one is, maybe what I got to do is give you a sustained or an extended release form that maintains an effective level but doesn't spike out. You know what I mean? But again,
I think one of our primary learnings from the 2 workshops which we convened is that this research and the use of these therapies in lymphoma and CLL will continue to evolve. They are evolving, and bringing together all key stakeholders across the spectrum will be critical as this continues.
That's important. As long as that, I think that's a piece that we, as you know, pharma companies are broken into clinical areas, and as long as that gets the word out to the oncology divisions in these companies, that's got to be a key message. But let me ask you another question. I mean, this gets back to Meghan's. What do you hear from a patient about tablet or capsule that could in any way be a hindrance? Is there something they don't like that, whereas, they get on the helpline and say, I don't like the color of the capsule, or, taste. Is there something there we should know?
Well, I think more often than not, this is unfortunately sometimes when Dr. Google rears his ugly head.
Oh, yes.
And so when a patient is researching a new treatment that's been recommended or prescribed by their physician, I think in this era we see many patients, many of us in fact, turn to the internet as the first point of research and information. And so unfortunately there's still a great deal of misinformation out there broadly about treatment for cancer, but then more specifically for specific treatments in particular disease states. And so I think here combating misinformation about different treatments, ensuring that patients fully understand which treatment regimen's been recommended or prescribed by their physician, is more often than not some of the questions our helpline and other colleagues in the patient education division are grappling with.
So that's the feedback on the app. I mean, that's obviously the reason it's there, right?
Yeah, certainly. So Focus on Lymphoma is the Lymphoma Research Foundation's mobile app. It was launched back in 2013. Actually, during that year was named one of the best healthcare apps by Apple. We're very proud of the time and effort our colleagues put into developing such a robust tool for people with lymphoma and their caregivers. There is a critical education component of our mobile app, which provides all of the rich disease-specific information, which is produced by our patient education division. And that's married with a very unique toolkit that have a host of resources that a lymphoma patient or their caregiver or even their healthcare team can utilize to help manage their care. So whether this is a running list of questions that a patient can keep track of to inform a dialogue with their physician or the nurse who's helping to managing their care, or a very precise medication manager which we have, which allows a patient to take a photo, an actual image of the treatment, perhaps an oral anti-cancer agent on their phone, and then incorporate that into the daily management of their use of that therapy. So tying that to a reminder mechanism in the app and in the native device, maybe their phone or the tablet that they're utilizing, and marry that against a side effect tracker that they can also utilize. And hearkening back to our conversation earlier that talked about kind of this shift and a change in the way patients are used to communicating with their healthcare team, what we found is for a patient to be able to independently manage the treatment or even disease side effects that they might be experiencing, tracking that on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and then being able to easily email that information to a member of their healthcare team, we've found and we've heard from healthcare professionals can actually be transformative in helping ensure that accurate and timely information is being sent from the patient to their healthcare team.
So, Dr. Williams, I would assume that in your conversation with your patients, this app comes up. I mean, it's got to be a tool you go to.
It is. I mean, so the patients who, as you said, there's a lot of resources people can get to when they've got a new diagnosis of lymphoma. The challenge for patients is sorting through all the confusion because, like I said, there's lots of different subtypes, and so patients will have come in, they've got a diagnosis of a particular type of lymphoma, and they or their family or friends have been on the internet pulling down all kinds of stuff that has mostly worried them to death, and about 98% of it is completely irrelevant to their situation. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to focus in on that, is to filter through it and get information that's meaningful and often reassuring about what can be done and what you can expect from this. And fortunately, as time has gone on, or especially over the last 2-3 years, many of the new patients that I see have already found their way to lymphoma.org before they see me, and they really like that, and they hopefully will use the app as they're getting into their therapy to have that link to follow up on. But it's the kind of information they need. When you get a new diagnosis of a cancer, and certainly it's true for lymphoma that I deal with. You know, I try to be careful about being thorough and explaining things, but if you ask them the next day, a lot of what I've said, they don't quite, they're just so distracted that they're thinking about the thing I just said. If hopefully they have somebody there listening and taking notes or recording it, but then they come back with other questions. So it's a steep learning curve for them, and they got to come to grips with it. They got to make decisions a lot of times about treatment, and so resources like this are just invaluable for patients and a real anchor for them. To hear it from another authority rather than just a consultant or their primary oncologist.
So, I mean, the way I see it, so make sure I understand, I mean, it's a resource for the patient, but what have you, I mean, is it predominantly the caregiver that uses the app too?
It's interesting. We see caregivers and patients utilizing the tool in equal measure. So particularly for those caregivers we've found who might be helping to manage the care of a patient long distance. So I'll use the example of a woman I met at a recent patient education conference that we convened. She is the daughter of a lymphoma patient, and she lives all the way across the country from her father, who recently received a lymphoma diagnosis. They have both downloaded the mobile app, and she has downloaded the information specific to his treatment regimen, and so they have identical treatment reminders going off tablets and phone at the exact same time. So in addition to the reminder he's receiving from Focus on Lymphoma, he's able to receive a follow-up phone conversation from his daughter to make sure he's being adherent, to see how he's feeling. So it's been interesting to see how the lymphoma communities embrace this tool and are really thinking about unique ways that they're using it to help manage their care.
We're going to, one thing we did want to touch on, because we're kind of starting to run out of time, but I think one of the things that we as an industry always think adherence is driven by the ability to dispense the medication. Case in point, oral contraceptives. I mean, for years we invented the dial pack. I mean, what I'm saying is that there's other types of stuff, a lot of pediatric dosing. Is there something we're missing in CLL or in specific, you know, that type of, is there something that we could be doing, the packaging for example?
Yeah, so there are a variety of things being looked at. I don't know the answer to the question. I think the way things are packaged currently, I think is pretty successful for the majority of patients. Like I said, they're motivated, they're taking it, they may have a caregiver who's helping make sure they're staying on task with it. But there are newer tools, and this comes back to some of the potential new studies that could be done looking at other ways to give it. So for example, you could have there are pill bottles that electronically report when somebody has opened it and got, whether they took it out and took it, we don't know, but they opened it. There are things where if somebody hasn't opened it within an hour of when a dose was due, it'll beep or do something else, which probably would irritate at least some people enough that they wouldn't put up with it for long. But we have to look at those kinds of things, both to assess what real compliance and adherence is and what can be done to help improve that. So those are things that came up. Again, it was part of my learning curve at our second workshop, and it's an area that we're hoping to explore further through the foundation and our collaborators in the and investigators who work with us.
So, I mean, let's try, as a wrap-up, I mean, as an industry, is there something we should be doing? I mean, we've heard about, you know, the range of a dose. I mean, we've heard about potential pack. Just think about, I mean, what's as a closing message, I mean, what would you tell us?
I mean, in summary, I would say to continue to collaborate. As I said earlier, I think these workshops have really opened our eyes to the need for a multidisciplinary, cross-channel approach to helping solve for some of the challenges we've identified, but as the use of these therapies continue to evolve and as more of them become available, I think something like 25% of the oncology products in the pipeline today are oral agents. This is clearly an idea who's come, and I think more often than not, people being treated for cancer may have the opportunity to utilize one of these treatments. So continuing to collaborate, conduct innovative research, not only on the therapies themselves, but on their use, on adherence, on compliance, on the impact for health-related quality of life for patients, I think will be critically important for us as a larger oncology community to continue to collaborate and share information toward the benefit of these patients.
Well, I have very little to add to that. I mean, it summarizes it nicely. I would say that one of the takeaways for me is that, you know, over the years, having been involved in a number of clinical studies in lymphoma and CLL therapy, you know, we're thinking very much about mechanism of action, what's the need in a particular area, you know, what subsets of patients tend to do poorly that we need a new way to get at it. And those are the kinds of things that we are interacting with our pharmaceutical colleagues about, because they've got tools. You know, we can test things in the laboratory and our translational groups. But one of the things that I, at least in my own experience of a number of years doing this, is that I don't remember very many discussions about formulation, packaging, delivery, dosing, things like that. We sort of find it in other ways. So I think a message I might give, and something we could explore as part of our ongoing efforts in this area, is to have those kinds of discussions as we get toward a phase 3 study or a drug that's going to be coming to market and we're doing the post-marketing analysis. I think we need to ask those sorts of things, and figure out what is really needed at the bedside and in the clinic for these patients. So I think it would maybe accelerate some of this, delivery of drugs that are going to be more effective, better tolerated, and people can be more easily adherent as we go forward.
And I just think it needs communication. Of course, Meghan, Mike, I got to tell you, when we kick off a development program, there's a key document that is created, and it's actually called a target product profile, and it drives everything else. And what it is the clinicians and the pharmacology, we sit there and what's it going to be? Well, I think we've learned a lot, especially, if you've been in cardiovascular, you know enough, TPP, but maybe that's what has to happen, because remember, the other one is the race to market, the race to cure. So it has to be balanced, but the communication will, because we don't just develop, we develop to a program, and there is a goal, and that goal is set out for the whole crew. With that, I want to thank Meghan and Dr. Williams. Thank you very much. That's it for INTERPHEX Live. Thank you.
Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX, presents INTERPHEX Live.